Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 2 on the new series of Warfare Through Time. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, remember the chronology. I said there were 4 sections, so we're starting with the earliest time period. We're starting with warfare in medieval England, 1250 to 1500. And this video we'll concentrate on the early part, 1250 to 1300. What was warfare like then? And then we can compare it to the later medieval period and see what changed and also what stayed the same, continuity. So we're starting with nature, the nature of warfare. 1250 to 1500. England was often affected or impacted by war. They were often at war. In that time period, they fought against France, against Scotland, against Wales, and actually against itself in a civil war known as the War of the Roses. So war was very important. It had a huge impact on English society. So this first video, we're looking at early medieval England, and we're looking at the nature of war. If you remember from video number 1, the nature of war, we're looking at the weapons that were used, the composition, there's that key word, the composition of the army, how the army was made up in early medieval England, what types of soldiers were there, what roles did they have, what were the numbers, how many. These were known as combatants, the actual fighters or soldiers. So this video will concentrate on the nature of war, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so let's get right down to it. Hopefully it'll be quite useful for you. Now, at that time, you've got to remember, there was no standing army. Well, what do we mean? Armies don't sit down. What do you want about O'Toole? A standing army? Well, a standing army, ladies and gentlemen, is like a permanent army. Always there, ready to fight. That wasn't the situation in early medieval England. So therefore, the king would have to call people to his army when they were needed. Now, in 1250, the army might be about the size of 5,000 or 10,000. Okay, how would the king organise and bring people to his army? Ladies and gentlemen, you may have done earlier in your school career, possibly in year 7, when you did the Normans, William the Conqueror, the Battle of Hastings and all that, you may have looked at something called the feudal system or the feudal society. Now, here's a simplified drawing of the feudal system. At the top, of course, everyone believed in God. Then we get the king, sometimes the queen, but in this case, the king. Underneath the king were the rich people, the nobles, the lords, the earls, the dukes. And under them were the knights. Right down the bottom were the labourers, the poor people. Now, the feudal system was a little bit like, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So the king gave land to his richest knights, his top men. He gave them lots of land. And in return, the king would say, look, I've given you something. I've done something for you. That means when I need your help, you will have to come and fight for me. You will come and do something for me. Can you see how it works? Equally, these top knights, nobles, lords, they were given land. It was too much for them, so they divided their land and gave it down to the smaller, less well-off knights who maybe had land but did not have titles. In return, when the king said to these men, you've got to come and fight for me and bring a lot of men to help, the top knights then said to the lower knights, well, I gave you the land, now you've got to come and fight for me, with the king. So it was all based on land, because land made people wealthy. So the king is saying to the top knights and the lower knights, here, have this land. In return, you've got to come and fight for me when I ask. That was the feudal system. Now, of course, that wouldn't provide enough people. So the people down at the bottom, the labourers, they would also have to go and fight. And I'll talk about them later. So that's how the king got an army in the early medieval period. It was based on the social structure at the time, the feudal system. Now, what types of soldier were in the army? What do you mean, what types of shoulder? You've only got one shoulder. No, not a type of shoulder, you idiot, O'Toole. Soldier. What types of soldiers made up the early medieval army? Well, at its simplest, there were two types. Infantry, foot soldiers, and cavalry, soldiers who fought on horseback. Infantry and cavalry. They're the two basic types of soldier. And in this video, we'll examine both of them. Let's start with the infantry. They're from the lower social class. The people down the bottom, the people who were not rich. Okay? They were not skilled with fighting with real weapons. Also, they probably did not own a horse. So the infantry, the foot soldiers, they were one part of the army. Okay? For example, many infantry fought at the Battle of Falkirk, case study number 1 that we'll have a look at in a couple of videos' time. Now, remember I said they were not skilled with weapons, but here we see things begin to change. Because as the period goes on, they did get more skilled with one weapon in particular. And I'll tell you it now, but we'll explain it in a later video. It was the longbow, ladies and gentlemen. They got far more skilled and it became a very important weapon, as we'll see at the Battle of Falkirk. So what jobs did the infantry do in the army? What were their tasks? Well, they had to withhold or withstand an enemy attack, often with a shield wall, spears, pikes, long sort of weapons to keep the enemy away. Then they would have to defeat the other infantry. The army attacking them, enemy infantry, would have to be defeated in very brutal hand-to-hand fighting, called a melee, often with swords, or indeed axes, okay, or daggers. Very, very brutal hand-to-hand fighting in the infantry. That was their job. We'll have a look at more of them as time goes on. Now, the second type of soldier, the cavalry. Cavalry. Remember what I said? They fought on horseback. It was very, very serious stuff. There was certainly no horsing around. Stop these jokes. I apologise. Now, what were the cavalry? They were mounted soldiers. They were the knights. They were from the upper end of society. Okay, they were richer. They had more higher social class. Knights, earls, dukes. They made up about 30% of the cavalry. And then the lower knights also came and made up the rest. Okay? Now, what were their jobs? What were their tactics? What did the cavalry do in battle? Well, the first one, a mounted charge. On your horseback, charge straight towards the enemy. A very important tactic. Again, we'll see this very clearly in the Battle of Falkirk. We'll get to that in a couple of videos' time. So, once they've mounted and charged at their enemy, what else would they do? A second tactic called rout and chase. If the enemy infantry had been scattered and were running away from the battlefield, the cavalry would chase after them and try and cut them down and kill them. So a mounted charge, rout and chase. They were the jobs of the cavalry. Okay? Now, command of the army. Well, obviously the king. The king's in charge. But the king would also select some of his top knights the very important rich people, and the king would put them in charge of part of the army. Now, notice, it's all done on money and social class, social status. Well, what if you're very, very rich, but rubbish? And what if you're a real good fighter, but poorer? Can you see how that might affect the battle? And there are examples of people in charge who really were not that good. So it wasn't ability or experience, it was all judged on wealth and social class and social status. There was a battle, the Battle of Lewes, L-E-W-E-S. Now, King Henry was attacking and doing quite well. Another part of his army was controlled by Prince Edward. But Prince Edward lost control of the cavalry, and the cavalry roared off the battlefield, and they didn't support King Henry's main attack, and therefore the main attack failed. A classic example of command of the army failing because they've judged it on the fact that he was a prince rather than good at his job. So that's command of the army, the king and the top knights. What about weapons? Well, cavalry, you had to have a horse, sometimes 2 horses, sometimes more. You had a lance or a spear, a very, very long weapon, maybe 2 or 3 meters long. And you'd also have a sword. Okay? So that's the weapons for the cavalry. What about protection? Oh, I've been waiting for this for a long time. Protection. Well, they had something called chainmail. And there it is. Can you just see? It's sort of like links of metal all linked in together. And it's very, very heavy, ladies and gentlemen. Quite expensive, so only the top knights would have the chainmail. Okay? Had something called a hauberk, H-A-U-B-E-R-K-S, a hood or a coif, C-O-I-F. Now, if I remove my glasses so I don't break them. Now, put that on. Can you see how it would work, ladies and gentlemen? Protection there at the front, but no protection here. Good protection there. And then the chainmail, the coif, protecting the back of the neck and the shoulders. So that would be quite good protection. A sword is not really going to make much damage there. An arrow isn't really going to hurt there. But of course it would hurt there. So that is protection, the helmets in early medieval warfare for the top knights. Okay, put that down. It's quite heavy. Chainmail was heavy, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Now the infantry, their weapon, again, swords, daggers, axes. They also had a club called a mace for bashing people. Okay. A halberd, H-A-L-B-E-R-D. A pole, long pole with an axe head on the end. Pikes like spears. Something called brown bills. And these were poles with a blade on the end and a hook. And as the soldier, the mounted knight, rode past, you try and hook them off the horse, pulling cavalry off the horse. They were the weapons of the infantry. Plus, I mentioned it earlier, the archers, the bows, the arrows, and later, the crossbows. I'll talk about them later. And most importantly, the longbows. They became a very important part of any army in English medieval warfare. What about protection for the infantry? They didn't have that big helmet there. They did not have the chainmail. Instead, for their protection, they often wore a leather or a padded linen jacket called a gambeson, G-A-M-B-E-S-O-N. Some infantry, maybe slightly richer, did wear short chainmail shirts. Most of them had a metal or a leather skull cap. So they are trying to protect the infantry just imagine standing there, maybe with a sword, and a man is roaring towards you on a horse. Very, very powerful. Would you fancy standing in front of them? Have a think about that. So, what about strategy during early medieval warfare? Well, remember, it's all controlled by the king. Remember, there's no standing army, so the king has to go and ask and tell the knights and the gentry to come and fight for him. He was limited. He was limited in the amount of men he could call, and they were limited. Not all of them had weapons. Yes, they used the feudal system, but if possible, the king would avoid battles. One, it was very risky. The king would often have to risk his life fighting, leading the battle. It was also limited by the season of the year. For some months of the year, earlier, they're planting the crops. So particularly the labourers are out in the fields planting the crops. They don't want to leave that and then go and have to fight. Again, later in the year, those labourers are harvesting the crops. So they're busy getting the food in for the rest of the year. So most of the actual campaigning, most of the fighting, most of the battles really occurred between the months of April to September. So it was quite limited. Another thing that limited it was communications. In a world that we live in, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure people who are watching this video, you've all got your mobile phones. You can contact people just like that. Well, it wasn't like that for the king in 1250. It was a very lengthy experience going and contacting the knights. You'd have to send a message and wait for the message to come back. So communications limited the warfare. The king often preferred to negotiate instead of fight, or the king often preferred to attack castles by siege, just surrounding the castle and waiting rather than risk the fight. Sometimes warfare was based on hit and run tactics, guerrilla warfare we call it now. Instead of having big set battles, just a raid where you would attack and then run away. Llewellyn used this very, very effectively in Wales, actually against the English kings. Guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics. And the final thing, ladies and gentlemen, I just mentioned it a minute ago, castles. Again, go back to 1066, William the Conqueror, Battle of Hastings, the Norman Conquest. Once he had won the battle and become king, 25th of December, 1066, what a Christmas present. He then had to control the country, and to do that he built castles. So there was a history of building castles to control an area. So if there are castles dotted all around an area, that is going to divide an attacking army, and they would have to lay siege to that castle, often 6 months, for example. So that's something else to consider when you talk about warfare. Finally, the importance of tactics and strategy. Most battles were won almost before the actual fighting occurred, depending on where you managed to place your army. For example, the Battle of Lewes, I mentioned it earlier, 1264. If you put your army on the high ground, you'd have a better chance of winning the battle. But it didn't always work like that. Remember case study 1, the Battle of Falkirk, that we'll look at in a couple of videos. One of the armies did manage to place their army on one of the leaders, put their army on top of the ridge, and yet they still lost. So it didn't always work. There were other reasons, other factors involved in tactics and strategy, and we'll deal with them. So, ladies and gentlemen, there we see early medieval warfare, the nature of warfare. We've looked at the size of the army, 5,000, 10,000. We've looked at the types of soldiers, the infantry, the cavalry. We've looked at the types of weapons that they used, the protection that they used, the tactics and the strategy and the command of the army. So it's there for us. That's our starting block. Nature of early medieval English warfare. Remember what I said? We'll look at how that changed and we'll look at what stayed the same. Our next video, exactly the same, early medieval warfare, but instead of it being the nature of the warfare, ladies and gentlemen, it's the other theme, the experience of the warfare. So that's coming soon. As ever, I hope it's been useful to you. All the best now. I'll speak to you soon. Bye now.